Thanks again for joining us today for our labor market insight webinar series from the Idaho Department of Labor. My name is Craig Shaw, and I'm the research supervisor at the department and your host today. This is our May installment where we take a topic that we give one of our labor economists around the state a full hour to kind of delve into a topic and explain their research and their analysis of the topic. And today's economist is Seth Harrington. He's in our Idaho's South Central region, located in Twin Falls. And he's going to provide an overview of broadband in Idaho and some of its intersections with the labor market in the state. And I'll give Seth a quick introduction here. He's been with the department, again, in the Twin Falls office since last October, so he's a fairly recent hire for us. He has a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Brigham Young University, Idaho. Prior to joining the department, he interned with the BYU Idaho Research and Business Development Center. He also worked at the Washington State Employment Securities Department and worked for a brief period in Nepal at the Indira Foundation. Seth, I'm going to turn it all over to you and let you kind of give us your presentation on broadband. What do you have for us?
Thank you so much, Craig. Well, as Craig mentioned, I am Seth Harrington. I'm the labor economist for South Central Idaho, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about broadband access in Idaho. The pandemic has really brought to light how important broadband is in our lives, and how lack of access can leave some individuals and communities behind. Many news outlets publish stories of workers who were forced to work remote during the pandemic and didn't have access to quality or access at all to broadband in their home. And they may have been forced to drive to a McDonald's parking lot or to get Wi-Fi to continue work. This is a pretty common story in rural areas. This also happened with students doing homework. They may have had to try to travel to libraries or fast food restaurants to get connection. This is especially true for rural areas like Idaho, where expanding broadband can be more expensive and difficult than in other regions of the United States. And so kind of on that note, I wanted to spend a little bit of time today looking at Idaho's current broadband situation and highlight the importance of broadband expansion in Idaho. There it goes. Okay. And so briefly before we dive in, I just want to go over kind of the topics for today. We'll have an introduction to the topic. Then we'll look at the broadband industry's occupational outlook, kind of look at on the labor side, where those jobs are going and kind of what we project to be happening there. Then we'll look at Idaho's current broadband situation. We'll look at challenges to broadband expansion and the benefits to broadband expansion. And then we'll wrap up by looking at some resources that are really helpful for broadband expansion and kind of good resources to kind of know exist out there for us in the state. So kind of before we really dive in, why is broadband so important? I think really to help answer this question, it's important to look back. Electricity and rural electrification is a pretty good historical framework to kind of compare to broadband. So thanks to the Rural Electrification Act, U.S. power grid expansion from 1930 to 1960 dramatically increased rural access to electricity. For kind of some good numbers, in 1930, under 10% of farm households had access to electricity. That number increased to over 90% by 1960. So we had rapid investments in rural electricity infrastructure, which led to economic expansion and slowed rural depopulation. So as rural America kind of got caught up with a lot of these technologies, it really helped keep jobs and industry in rural areas and not just all flocking to cities or more urban areas. And this helped with rural depopulation as it kind of provided incentive for people to stay in these more rural communities. Rural electrification also increased property values, increased general efficiency, and increased standard of living. So it did a lot of really good things to help kind of catch up rural America to kind of the economic ability that the more urban city centers have. However, studies have shown that rural electrification really primarily only help the ag sector. So when we look at kind of where that electrification, really what industries it targeted, really mostly just ag. This is also mostly due to the fact that ag is really a really dominating force in rural areas. But that's really where kind of that growth was centered. Rural broadband can bring has a similar capacity to create growth. So how electrification kind of brought up rural areas and kind of leveled that playing field. That gap has been widening with broadband. That's kind of the more modern version of this problem that we're having, where rural areas have amenities and abilities that rural areas are increasingly getting less and less of, which is causing some equity issues. Rural broadband expansion brings all the benefits that rural electrification did, and it can bring many more. It can impact far more industries than just agriculture, although it definitely has strong effects on agriculture. The world and the economy is much more complex than it was back then. Rural broadband access is a 21st century need to increase rural America's standard of living and help level the economic playing field. What is rural broadband internet? So the Federal Communications Commission defines broadband as an always-on connection that provides 25 megabit per second download and 3 megabit per second upload speeds. Download speeds are how quickly your internet connection can retrieve data from the internet. This would be things like web pages, videos, photos, etc. Upload speed is how quickly your internet connection can send data from your devices to the internet. It's sending documents, posting on Facebook, things like that. To give kind of a rough idea, I guess in more general terms, what this speed can kind of provide, this speed is roughly enough for 2 users to stream video in 1080p without buffering, play a majority of online games without latency, and virtually no wait time for loading web pages. This graphic here kind of does a good job breaking down what kind of internet speed can support what kind of user base and kind of what rough speeds to expect. 25.3 is a decent speed for small households or households with light users, but faster speeds may be needed for larger households or heavier use households. Some experts think that with increasing bandwidth demand from software and teleworking, 100 megabit download should be the official definition of broadband. So this 25.3 definition was brought to the FCC in 2015. So it's getting pretty dated, especially with the explosion of telework and just our world being more and more digitized kind of daily. That maybe this definition is kind of outdated, but currently it's what we have, and that's kind of roughly what to expect from a speed, that kind of speed. So now that we kind of have an introduction to the topic, I want to dive into our occupational outlook, kind of what's happening on the labor side of broadband. Unfortunately, we don't have industry codes for broadband specific occupations. Broadband also covers some different occupations and industries. It's kind of hard to generate an occupational outlook. So here selected are top occupations in the telecommunications industry that are directly tied to broadband to kind of give a representative look at broadband industry's outlook. So we have employment numbers from 2001 and projected out to 2033, excuse me. And I kind of want to highlight our growth from 2023, our projected growth, and kind of compare it to the national level. So our telecommunications equipment installers and repairers have a 23.8% projected growth in the state over the next 10 years. That's compared to 8% nationally. Telecommunications line installers and repairers have a 14.7% projected growth, compared to nationally, it's 6%. Computer network support specialists have a 22.7% projected growth in the state, compared to 6% nationally. Computer network architects have a 15.2% projected growth, compared to 4% nationally. And network and computer systems administrators have a 13.4% projected growth in the state, compared to 3% nationally. So a lot of our big telecommunications jobs that are directly tied to broadband have 10-year projected growth rates that are double or triple the national projected growth. So as these projects are put into place, we have really high demand for these positions and kind of really are showing demand for increasing broadband. In fact, the telecommunications industry has a 10-year projected growth rate in the state of 22.8% or 28.8%, excuse me. So we really do see a lot of increasing demand as these projects are started and planned. And like I mentioned before, other industries also are impacted by broadband's increased implementation. Some examples, things like construction, developing this infrastructure, and customer service centers have increased demand as broadband is expanded. And so there's really not just, this really does impact so much of the economy that it's not just going to impact these tech sectors, but also a lot of ancillary and support sectors as well. Job postings are also a pretty strong demand indicator. So we have telecommunications job postings in the state. We have back from 2015 to now. We saw that monthly postings had a really strong spike in 2020 to 2021 as the pandemic really highlighted the necessity of internet connectivity. We did see a drop-off kind of decline in 2022. That was a global trend as telecommunications revenues dropped worldwide around 10%, citing supply chain disruptions. And so we saw, however, this average is still pretty high compared to where we were before the pandemic. And then we have seen recent pretty strong gains. So the first quarter of 2023 is looking quite strong, even with fear of a looming recession and a slightly cooling labor market. We still see pretty high demand here in this industry. Graphing this industry, we do see concentration in MSAs and more urban areas, which isn't very surprising, but we are seeing more rural counties have higher levels of employment in this industry. And like I mentioned, as these projects these rural projects are underway and are being worked on, there'll be more demand in those rural areas. Wage growth is also quite high. So this is a median wage growth for those selected occupations. Blue is 2019, orange is 2021. All selected occupations have seen wage increases over the pandemic, with the largest growth in telecommunications line installers and repairers growing 16.3%. We do notice a gap here for 2019 for our computer network architects. We had insufficient data in 2019, but it's pretty safe to assume this also grew in wage as most wages grew during the pandemic, especially for higher educated positions. So now that we've kind of looked at the labor market and kind of the labor side, I want to look at each big connection types, internet connection types in their relation to Idaho, kind of looking at the current broadband situation. I want to start with DSL, or digital subscriber lines. This service provides internet through telephone lines. There's lots of existing infrastructure with DSL, making it one of the most accessible forms of service. So this is a FCC broadband map. So the FCC provides broadband maps that can be broken down by connection type and speed by state. These are helpful for giving us kind of a more granular look at which connection types are prevalent in our area, our state, and kind of just gives us that information. These darker blue spots are areas with higher concentration. Lighter blue is less concentration. DSL has download speeds of around 5 to 100 megabits per second, uploads of 1 to 30 megabits per second. It has a high price per megabit. It's $1.53 is kind of the national average price per megabit, but a lower monthly bill because it has one of the lowest megabit wired plans. It could be an alternative to satellite in rural areas if they're close to a provider's office. So it can be used in some rural areas as it has the best coverage of any wired option we have in the state. Each household also has their own dedicated connection, so they don't have to share their bandwidth like they do with cable. Looking at cable, you notice there's a lot more concentration in these urban parts of the state compared to DSL. So we see deeper blue, but really only concentrated in these more urban parts of the state. It has more plans and speed options than DSL, so you can get a lot faster download upload speeds compared to DSL. It's kind of the middle option in price per megabit, 77 cents per megabit's the national average there. So these kind of plans can power large households or households of heavy users. But you may have to share bandwidth with neighbors, which can create slowdowns during more peak hours. It can also be a good option if your household wants to bundle services. Many cable services provide discounts the more services you bundle, but they can be expensive if you only want an internet plan. Sometimes they're more expensive. And our last wired connection to look at today is fiber, which is our fastest by far. Speeds are very, very quick. It provides service through a thin glass and fiber cable, which is more durable than metal cables and uses light to emit data, which allows for a more efficient transfer of data than cable or DSL. It's the lowest price per megabit, but it's the most expensive wired bill as you have a lot of megabits in any of your plans. It's the fastest and most reliable option. It doesn't have a lot of existing infrastructure like cable or DSL has, which makes it pretty expensive to install, especially in rural areas where connecting requires lots of construction, which can be quite expensive for internet service providers to fulfill. And our last coverage type we're going to look at today is satellite, which has the best coverage by far. A majority of our map is covered, but download speeds are dependent on location, and they're also fairly disrupted by weather. So it's a fairly inconsistent connection because you're not physically hooked up through your household, which can create some complications. You also need to install a physical dish, and there's generally pretty high minimum contract terms. So usually around 2 years minimum contract, and it's fairly expensive, usually around $100 a month. So it's our widest coverage option, but it's our less consistent, and it has kind of some extra hoops to jump through that the wider ones don't necessarily have. So this is our general broadband map in Idaho. So this is any of our technologies at broadband speeds or faster in the state. And I think it's important to look at this map and understand a couple things about it. So this FCC map is likely an underestimation of the issue. This map is constructed using self-reported data from internet service providers. This self-reported data allows an internet service provider to declare an entire census block as covered if it can serve at least one household in that block. So many professionals think that FCC data is slightly underestimating the issue. So some researchers have taken it upon themselves to kind of try to estimate kind of how big that gap is, maybe from the overestimation. So Broadband Now is a broadband research group that tried to tackle this by running a study selecting over 58,000 addresses, at least 1,000 in each state, and using the ISP's check availability tools to see if they had access to a terrestrial broadband connection. And they kind of extrapolate that data on the national level. So they estimate, so as the FCC estimates that 96% of Idahoans have access to broadband as of 2021, Broadband Now research, using that research, estimates it's probably closer to 86%. So there's probably about a 10% gap between what the FCC reports and really maybe the real challenge. So these kind of things are important to know when we're talking about the data, is there are some gaps that are maybe important to know about. And then running over just kind of general quick facts about Idaho's broadband situation. Idaho ranks 34th in the nation in Broadband Now's annual ranking. This accounts for availability, coverage, and speed. 84% of Idahoans have access to a wired speed of 25.3 megabits per second or greater. This is compared to 89.9% nationally. Only 38.5% of Idahoans have access to a low-priced broadband plan. This is classified as a plan that costs $60 a month or less without promotions or government assistance. And that's compared to 89% nationally. And only 29% of Idahoans have access to a fiber optic broadband service. This is compared to 43% nationally. So we are doing quite good, but there are a couple, we are in a couple ways have significant gaps between kind of the national level. But Idaho also has some unique challenges that make that a little more difficult. So I want to spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the challenges Idaho has in adopting and implementing broadband. And I really want to highlight Idaho's rural divide. So this is American Community Survey estimates on tracking different types of internet access growth. So our blue is our types of households with one or more types of computing devices. This is households with an internet subscription. This is households with broadband of any type. And this is households without an internet subscription. And I really want to highlight the difference between urban and rural Idaho. So from 2017 to 2021, rural households in Idaho have seen smaller percentage increases in internet subscriptions, our orange bar, and computing devices, our blue bar, than urban households. So urban households or rural households have seen a 1.3% less of an percentage increase in internet subscriptions compared to urban Idaho, and 0.5% less in computing devices than urban Idaho. Rural households have also seen a slower decrease in households without internet access than urban households in Idaho. So urban households from 2017 to 2021 have seen about an 8% decline in households without internet subscriptions compared to rural Idaho, which is about a 6.3% decline. So there's noticeable gaps between urban and rural Idaho's internet access growth. Idaho in general, Idaho has been growing faster than the national level, but we have noticed that rural Idaho is being left behind. Like we mentioned before, expanding service to rural areas is very expensive, especially technologies like fiber. And much of the rural divide is caused by the expense of providing access to rural areas. It's also important to note there's certain populations that may have increased difficulties affording or accessing the internet. The Idaho Information Technology Services has created this digital divide index map, which can also give us some more insight into where we might have additional challenges. Higher values or darker spots on the map are indicate a higher level of divide, and lighter and lower levels will indicate a lower level of divide. This index will account for demographics that disproportionately struggle with affording or accessing the internet. These, for example, rural households, senior populations, non-English speakers, or households in poverty. This index also includes a crime and diversity index wrapped in with the main index. So this is a really strong indicator that captures lots of different demographics and kind of covers more on the systemic end of areas that may just need more help regardless of where the connection is. And this can kind of really help us visualize where those divides may be. We also have pretty limited broadband data. So like I mentioned before, this FCC map is developed by self-reported data through a form called Form 477, which is a form that internet service providers fill out twice a year. And this form allows them to claim a census block as covered if they can at least serve one household on that block. This leads to FCC data underestimating the problem and overestimating coverage. And this lack of data does lead to some guesswork on where the issues lie. Resources like our digital divide index map can help solve this problem, but in general, finding broadband data can be a challenge. Cost is also a barrier. So this is Idaho household incomes broken down by less than 20,000, between 20,000 and 75,000, and 75,000 and above. And we're tracking with a dial-up subscription alone. Fortunately, almost nobody, regardless of income, it's under 1% regardless of income, across the state have access to just a dial-up subscription. And then our orange is with a broadband subscription, and our gray is without an internet subscription. We have seen great adoption from 2017 to 2021 in our lowest income bracket, and we have seen a decline in those without, which is great. But we can still note that there's a significant gap still between those under 20,000 and the other income brackets in both of our measured metrics here. Cost still remains a challenge. Households that make less than $20,000 a year are 49% more likely to not have an internet subscription compared to households making between $20,000 and $75,000. Again, according to Broadband now, only 38.5% of Idahoans have access to a low-price broadband plan, which is that broadband plan that costs less than $60 a month. Cost is also a challenge on the supply side, not just the demand side. Extending fiber to rural areas has lower returns than urban areas. It's more expensive to usually they're further out from their main network, which causes increased construction costs. Additionally, their customer base in a rural area is smaller than an urban area. And so this is an issue for both parties. Public-private partnerships are a solution currently being implemented to help fix this problem, to try to incentivize ISPs and kind of make those cost benefits a little more in their favor, to incentivize them to extend their services out to these rural areas. And finally, education and training. Even with broadband access, if people don't know how to use these devices or software, it's going to do minimal help. The Digital Equity Act defines covered populations the state plans to address to target digital equity. And so these are 2019 census numbers. So they're a little outdated, but it still illustrates the point well. These are populations that we've determined may have additional challenges in affording or accessing internet. And they're large percentages of our population. 40% are rural, about a fifth are ethnic minorities or racial minorities, over a fifth are age 16 over, and about a fifth or households with incomes at or below 150% of the poverty level. And so there's a lot of Idaho may have additional challenges, regardless of having access. And so it's important to also know that this is an education and training issue as well. Kind of moving on to now what broadband can really do for our state. broadband has a lot of different applications across not only the economy, but really just every part of our lives. It can really impact what the CDC coins are social determinants of health, which are non-medical factors that can help influence and improve health outcomes. So I kind of want to spend some time selecting kind of parts of this pie and how broadband can really help increase our ability to increase our quality of life here in the state. Starting with health, telehealth is a big one. According to the CDC, people who live in rural areas of the United States are more likely than urban residents to die prematurely from heart disease, cancer, unintentional injury, chronic lower respiratory disease, and stroke. And they primarily cite the lack of routine checkups with this figure. And those are more difficult in rural areas where there are less healthcare specialists and generally less just health resources. Telehealth can help close this gap regardless of geography. And so the USDA created a study on telehealth in rural communities. And I want to just kind of look at these, go through these graphs really quick. So this is use of online health research, and this is broken down by age and by urban and rural. Not very surprising, rural, regardless of age, rural areas sought health research, online health research less than urban areas. I don't think that's incredibly surprising. But what is important to note is our 65 plus column here, our orange column, our yellow column, excuse me, is lower than all other columns except this 15 to 24 demographic. And so people who disproportionately need these services the most, which would be seniors, seem to be accessing it almost the last, regardless of urban or rural. This really shows that, unfortunately, rural and senior Americans are less likely to use these services than younger and urban Americans. And this study really cites education, especially with senior citizens, just knowing how to access or find these services. And in rural areas, especially an access issue with just lack of broadband infrastructure. And so with training and with access, hopefully we can kind of bump up these numbers as these people need this more than most. This is especially true in rural areas as they have increased senior populations. And on the labor side, this really helps stretch the reach of healthcare specialists, which are a pretty hard to staff position statewide right now, especially in rural areas. And so by increasing telehealth access, we can help reach these rural communities more efficiently with relatively fewer healthcare specialists. So that's something important to note. There's also increased educational opportunities with broadband access. It really helps democratize education, which can help open doors to lots of different opportunities for rural Idahoans. There are tons of free websites that offer education and training. I'm going through a couple here. Khan Academy has general free K through 12 courses. Coursera has free courses in machine learning, the science of well-being, and successful negotiation, just as a couple examples. Udemy and Code Academy have resources to learn Python programming and other programming languages, which are an increasingly valuable skill, especially in more technical fields. And YouTube has a bit of everything, but it's a bit harder to search because it's not necessarily designed as an educational or a training tool. But there's tons of universities who will post lectures on there and tons of interesting educational content. So broadband connection really helps allow individuals to change careers and upskill on a flexible schedule and usually at a low or free cost. So this is really helpful in kind of helping employees maybe change career paths or learn new skills on their own time, which can help them in employment opportunities. Speaking of employment, broadband really can help bolster employment opportunities by opening up more of the labor force to broadband. This will allow workers to more easily apply for lots of positions quickly. This helps up speeding the hiring process up for both employees and employers. Businesses can save money as e-recruiting is a cheap way to access large pools of candidates. Workforces that are digitally competent can bring increased productivity to firms, which can bring increased wages to workers, kind of a win-win scenario. And increased broadband adoption helps open the door for increased economic development and investment. The first thing many companies are looking for when they're moving into a more rural area is how broadband capacity is. And so if we can increase our broadband capacity in more rural parts of the state, this will not only help increase economic investment in more rural parts of the state, creating a more level playing field. It'll also allow for our populations in those areas to stay more stable and increase, and it just kind of helps increase the gains Idaho has seen over the past couple of years to a wider audience of people. This also opens the door for remote work opportunities, which is a kind of a fixture of the pandemic, but has seen more of a decline recently as we recover from the pandemic. However, it's still a benefit or perk that many employees are very demanding of. There's many surveys that show a very similar story to this, regardless of generation. Most people surveyed said they would accept a 5% salary reduction to be able to stay in a job that lets them work from home. And this is a pretty common narrative right now that employees are very much wanting this perk and will take even salary cuts to keep it. This also helps, remote work helps expand the labor pool. We're in a tight labor market, especially for those more technical positions. And if they can be done remotely, offering them remotely can help expand your labor pool, which is a really valuable tool right now. Increased access to remote work can also help bring back discouraged or sidelined workers, for example, disabled, veterans, or elderly, which helps also address our labor shortages. So properly implementing remote work can also help subsidize kind of our current issue with our lack of labor force. And wrapping up some of the benefits, there's way more, but just kind of closing out on a couple of bullet points here. Allowing online banking services at home can be a helpful tool for especially senior citizens managing finances. Again, increasing property values. Broadband has the capacity to increase your property value. Increasing business formation as these areas have higher access or more access to broadband. This will allow increased investment to exist and increased business population to exist in these areas, which also helps with population growth. Those kind of go hand in hand. And it also increases access to e-commerce, which can help businesses with their supply chain, but also help consumers get access to an increased amount of products, kind of also increasing their quality of life. And I kind of want to start now looking at funding opportunities right now. We have kind of once in a lifetime funding for broadband expansion right now from federal funds. And I kind of want to highlight those now. So our Idaho Broadband Fund grants are currently funding 2 projects, a $20 million public-private partnership to lay 198 miles from Grangeville to Star, and a $6.3 million Port of Lewiston project, which will connect Moscow to Grangeville. So we have a couple of projects already funded that'll really help bolster our capacity up in northern Idaho, which is an area kind of notorious for lack of broadband access. Our Capital Projects Fund addresses challenges in rural America by helping provide access to modern broadband infrastructure needed to address critical services. The CPF will address last mile broadband projects to address the needs of unserved and underserved locations, with a focus on bringing telehealth and education to those communities. Our Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or our BEAD program, provides funds to expand high-speed internet access by funding planning, infrastructure adoption, and deployment programs. And it has $500,000 set aside for local planning grants. And this funding is administered through the Department of Commerce, not Labor. There's an important caveat there. And then I want to conclude on covering a couple important programs and resources we have access to here in the state that I think people should know more about. Starting off with our Affordable Connectivity Program. This is administered through the FCC. If eligible, a household can receive $30 a month discount on internet service, and it can be up to $75 a month on tribal lands. Additionally, we offer a $100 one-time device discount that's limited to 1 per household. And eligibility details are available on the website affordableconnectivityprogram.gov. The University of Idaho has a digital economy program that has a couple of really helpful tools. So first of all, it has access to these kind of dashboard snapshots of broadband, and they're broken down by the county. They have one for each county in the state. They have broadband data, they have demographic data, they have locational data, lots of really cool stuff here. So I'd recommend checking those out if you're interested. They also have a remote work certificate, which is a program designed to help new remote workers kind of navigate remote work compared to a more traditional, I guess, work environment. They also have a similar program for managers or leaders of remote workers. And they're currently working on an e-commerce training program. So to get those who want to start their own online business, and also an adult computer literacy course. Those are currently in development. So I'm excited to wait for when those are ready to go. Internet for All is a really awesome one-stop resource to get information on funding programs. This stuff can get kind of confusing, and so they really break it down by program, descriptions of what it does, what it funds, from what agency, and also has timelines and officer contact info. So you can contact, call, or email any officers who help run this program in your state. So this is a really helpful tool for kind of navigating funding and where to get it from, and who contact. And then finally, the Idaho Commission of Libraries has there's a lot of awesome work, but I really want to highlight specifically their digital access workbook, which is an excellent resource that has data, activities, and tons of links to organizations that are working on broadband connectivity. The workbook is kind of intended to help communities form action groups and start investigating and defining local community needs. So it's really a good place to look for not just having access to lots of links of organizations and people, but also helping start a plan in your community to help increase access to broadband and digital equity. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Seth. Good presentation. Thank you for that. Again, this is our space for you to ask any questions you might have for Seth and his presentation. If you have any, just please submit them in the Q&A format or window, and just select the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. While we're waiting for any questions, we've got a few kind of ready for you there, Seth. The first one is kind of a simple one, I guess, is how does one go about checking their internet speed, and how is the speed in broadband relative to the importance for a job seeker or someone that's looking to telework and that type of thing?
Definitely. There's lots of resources online for free ways to check your internet speeds or tests to check what internet speeds maybe your household will need. And so there's lots of options there. Speeds are really important, especially for those who want to telework or work from home. That can be really heavy on your bandwidth. And so having a proper speed to telework effectively is a way definitely that can affect workers. That's a primary one. And also as households become more online and children have more work from homework that's more demanding, these can also impact households heavily. But primarily, it's important for teleworkers to have enough stable connection to connect from home, stream if they need to, and upload documents.
Okay, so thank you for that. When we're talking about service providers, in your research, did you come across any measurements of market concentration for Idaho or the county overall, or a county?
Unfortunately, I didn't. Price data and that kind of more locational data is pretty notoriously difficult to find. And so I can dig a little deeper, but I did not find any data really on regional concentrations.
And that kind of leads me into my next question, which is we're kind of, would you say we're at the beginning of this transition? Like you compared the broadband expansion, you compared that to the historical electric grid expansion. How would you compare like the phase we're in of the broadband effort to that one, in terms of that one went from like 1930 to 1960 overall? Are we at the very beginning of this? Has this been going on for a while? What would you say on that?
Yeah, I think pre-pandemic, we were kind of making a lot of noise about this. And then as the pandemic hit, it really kind of forced, especially those of us who live in more urban areas, and this is less of I guess maybe a consideration for us, really kind of forced us to realize how important this is in our lives. I think we're probably now still probably near the start, as projects are kind of just now coming down the pipeline of the funding we're getting. I think the pandemic really kind of helps the narrative and just really kind of illustrate how critical it is, and when we don't have it, how kind of detrimental it can be for us. I think also electricity now is treated like a utility, right? But internet service is still kind of treated like a service, not a utility. And so I think as a good framework to look at kind of broadband is to look at it more like a utility. It's really not optional much anymore for any of us who want to contribute to society. You really kind of need at least access to broadband. And internet, I mean, and electricity has been treated like that for a long time. And so I think maybe getting that kind of narrative pushed might be a tool to help us maybe expand broadband more diligently than maybe we think we need to, maybe.
Okay. And you'd mentioned in that electric grid expansion that the ag industry was kind of the primary industry that benefited from that. Of course, that was the primary industry in rural areas, and I think it probably still is in a lot of areas. Would you anticipate that would be also the primary beneficiary, or how would you look at, like, looking at an industry makeup? What rural areas would be most benefiting from that? And would you anticipate any kind of transformation from a broadband infrastructure investment?
Yeah, I think it's because the economy is just so much more complex than it was then. And even industries like ag have seen drastic advancements in technology. I think it's hard to quantify which ones will see bigger gains. I think it really will have pretty broad applications across almost all industry. I think it's also hard to kind of think about what will happen because I think we've just lived without it there for so long. It's kind of hard to almost imagine what that will be like. I think it still definitely will help ag more than most. I think I can pretty confidently say just because ag is such a big part, especially in Idaho, of our rural area is pretty dominated by our agriculture. I think that won't change. But I think increasing their connectivity to devices and just the general kind of economy will really kind of help ag maybe plant smarter, more efficiently, maybe free up more space or produce a crop more efficiently, things like that. I also think that, like, as we think about increased connectivity, it really just opens the door for a lot of collaboration that maybe we don't have now. And so it really just kind of opens up the world, or really opens up our state to other parts of the state and the nation, and really can open up lots of collaborative processes that we don't have right now.
So did you, as you were looking into this, did you run across any communities in Idaho that had an investment that like a town that just had recently had their broadband expanded, or in the last few years during the pandemic, perhaps?
I haven't seen any specific, haven't read up on that specifically, but many have been forced into libraries in smaller towns, especially, as libraries are a pretty consistent place that has broadband.
Okay. And then what would you say are the workforce implications of expanding the broadband expansion as well? You kind of touched on it with the projections, but just in kind of you're reading it, and just as the labor economist in the South Central area, what kind of changes would you be looking for in the next few years? Yeah,
I think especially we were talking about agriculture, and in South Central, the name of the game is manufacturing. Both industries that historically have been more labor intensive, but have drastically been more capital intensive, more machine focused and processes. I think the general workforce is going to be probably leaning more towards computer skills, and not anything necessarily like, not everyone has to learn programming maybe, but like just being more aware how to use online tools and services. Just as the world is more digitized, and as we expand broadband, it has the capacity to spread even more. Just kind of getting workers maybe more used to computer processes, software, and just general online communication, I think will be a growing need going forward.
And would you anticipate wages would be affected by broadband expansion? Do you think that would increase wages in those areas? What would you expect?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, with kind of broadband being able to open up the job market, that's true for employees and employers. So it definitely opens up more opportunities for those employees to pursue higher wages. Hopefully it's in the state, but if we have access to broadband, they can telework to another state if they'd like to. or that really opens up the market on both ends. And so I would anticipate wages increasing as employers can have employees and employers have wider options.
And as we've talked about a lot for the last few years, there's a workforce tightness. Does the expansion plans, are they running into any friction with that workforce? Are they able to hire the workers they need for internet expansion?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of data on the state level, but we have seen national studies that do indicate a labor shortage will impact, at least on the national level, broadband expansion. Fortunately, right now, lots of these companies are willing to subsidize education to hire trained staff to lay this network. Additionally, the Investment and Jobs Act also has funding to help subsidize this workforce. And we also have Idaho Launch. So luckily, regionally, we have lots of tools to help support those who want to transition into these careers through funding and subsidization. But this definitely can be a barrier in expanding this broadband, as we do have a workforce shortage. Definitely.
Okay. A colleague of yours has a comment that I'll just share it, and then you can add your 2 cents to it, which is that they suspect that one thing that broadband might open is some manufacturers might be more willing to locate in areas remote, rural areas that are remote from their headquarters, and with sufficient broadband, they'd be able to monitor and control the processes at manufacturing. Would you? I'll just leave it at that. What would you care to say to that comment?
Definitely. Like I mentioned before, like one of the first things that a company might want to move to a more rural location is looking for. It's like water and broadband are really some of the 2 biggest things they're looking for. And so as that technology is developed, you're really investing in a community. And as a community attracts more business, that kind of just that compounded growth, definitely correct there. That if we can kind of create that ecosystem, it can really help expand service and business across the state.
Well, I think that exhausts the questions we have from our audience, and the questions I have. Any other comments that you would care to offer that may have come up while we're talking?
Yeah, I just kind of I mentioned before, there's really kind of once in a lifetime funding coming up soon over the next couple of years. And so if anyone is really interested in pursuing expansion or just kind of wanting to learn more, those links are really helpful there. And when the article drops later this month, there's even additional services and things to look for there. And so I'd really recommend checking those out if that's something that interests you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Seth. Next webinar is already scheduled for June 6th. We'll have a bit of a change up from the format we've had up till now. We will actually have a panel of 2 or 3 of our labor economists, and we will be discussing a preview of the results of our recent Idaho Employer Climate Survey. So hopefully you can join us for that. And we'd also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared towards job seekers and employers, but we also have free access to labor market information. You can access that at lmi.idaho.gov. And there you can find a variety of dashboards and resources, as well as a page dedicated to the regional information, as well as a directory of one of our 6 labor economists that are located around the state and the one that's closest to you. With that, again, I'd like to thank you for attending our webinar today. Hopefully you enjoy May and enjoy the weather. Hopefully it gets better. Thank you for attending. Have a good day and good luck. Thank you.